Welcome to the third session of the Gene Drive Research Forum's series of panel discussions for considering the case of gene drive technologies through social science theories on stakeholder engagement. We are grateful to all who have joined us live today, and for the third session in a row, we have global participation from a wide range of stakeholder groups. And in case any of you missed either of the first two sessions, you'll be happy to know that they were recorded and can be viewed on YouTube. My name is Karen Tudis, and I work for the Gene Convene Global Collaborative, an initiative at the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health. This series is co-hosted through the Gene Drive Research Forum by Gene Convene and by the Genetic Biocontrol of Invasive Rodents Partnership, also known as the GBIRD Partnership, represented by my very able collaborator, Mr. Royden Saw. Today's session, which is focused on including social criteria during field site selection, will be moderated by Dr. Katie Barnhill-Dilling of North Carolina State University, whose research interests lie in using stakeholder, community, and public engagement as a tool for just governance processes. Thank you so much, Katie. We look forward to an interesting and probing discussion that you have planned for us today. And with that, I'll turn the session over to you to introduce the panelists and begin the dialogue.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you to our panelists joining us from, I think, at least 3 continents and a range of time zones. And thank you to those of you out there joining us this morning, afternoon, and evening. I join you from Durham, North Carolina, where I'll start by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional lands of the Saponi Confederation, including the Okanichi, the Eno, and the Shakori. And I'm just across the creek, basically, from the edge of the Tuscarora lands as well. We have a great lineup of speakers today, representing a range of issues, as Karen said, continents and perspectives. Our speakers include Paulo Paes de Andrade, who's a full professor living out his retirement at the Department of Genetics at Federal University of Pernambuco, past member of the Environmental Risk Assessment Subcommittee for the Brazilian National Technical Commission on Biosafety. And he's drafted and revised regulations and reshaped the Brazilian GMO regulatory framework. We're also joined by Karl Campbell, Executive Director for the Latin American region of island conservation. He has 20 years of island restoration experience and managing field operations. He's engaged with stakeholders considering incremental and potentially transformative conservation innovations to help stem the loss of biodiversity. We have Tib Habtewell, a senior research scientist at Imperial College London. He's an applied entomologist and malaria transmission specialist with over 20 years of work experience. Currently, he works on the Transmission Zero project, developing standards for measuring the blocking of malaria transmission, and he works on designing modular mobile insectary and laboratory systems for field testing of transgenic mosquitoes. We have Naima Sykes, who's Stakeholder Engagement Manager for the Target Malaria Project, working again on stakeholder engagement and as a strategic communications specialist. She's worked with governments and multinational organizations and has worked across multiple sectors, including agribusiness, infrastructure, and extractives. And finally, we have Riley Taddingfunk, she's a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Communication at UC San Diego. Her current project is an ethnographic study of gene drive technologies and the role of community engagement in guiding decision-making about its use. She's committed to community engaged scholarship that centers Indigenous knowledge and contributes to decolonial solidarities among Indigenous communities. So for our first introduction to these big questions that we're going to address today, I'm going to ask that all our panelists address, starting us off, what do we even mean by field site selection? So our big question is, as we think about the question of field testing site selection, what is your context for understanding what a field testing site selection might be? For example, what are the geographic parameters? What kind of site? What's being treated? And some of these questions. So Tib, you're up first in my round robin, so I'm going to invite you to answer first. Don't forget to unmute.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, as you said, I'm working at Imperial College at the moment, Transmission Zero project. Our main target organism is Anopheles gambiae SS, and we are intending to generate refractory mosquito strain carrying Antiplasmodium effectors, and we are aiming to drive it into the population using gene drive. And we are considering two independent components, that's driving component and then effector component, generating a test independently. And once we are happy with it, we're going to be combining in the release site the driving component and effector component. So that would ease regulatory and monitoring kind of work where for us, it simplifies things for monitoring. So for this, we are working with IHI in Tanzania at Infakara Health Institute, and we are focusing in Tanzania for our first test site. And we selected about 6 islands in Lake Victoria region. So the islands we are looking into are not far enough to completely isolate or completely break the exchange of genes between, but it would help us to minimize reinvasion of mosquito from neighboring sites, so that we could cleanly control and monitor what we are doing. So that's our aim and our area of interest. And we focus in Anopheles gambiae SS, which is East African kind of major vector species. Thanks.
Thank you. Karl, you're up next in my docket.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. So I'm working with the Genetic Biocontrol Invasive Rodents program, and we're working on mice as our test subject, as it's the genetic model and is also found invasive on many islands around the world. And it's driving a whole suite of species to extinction on islands around the world. The aspect, if you will, for a field site and a test field site really provides sort of an out-of-laboratory setting for trials that look towards testing aspects of efficacy and of safety under field conditions. And these sort of sites, would allow for confinement of the modified organism. And that really depends then, on what your modified organism is. How does it disperse? For example, would be one of the things that you would take into account for, well, what actually makes a good, trial site in this case. And it's also important, I think, to remember that these trial sites only come basically after a series of really, deliberate, stepwise laboratory trials. So there's a whole suite of work that goes on before you're even getting to these places. And they're looking also to demonstrate these aspects of safety, efficacy. And you're looking at things like regulatory approvals, and you're going through environmental and social impact assessments. And interesting to note that the environmental social impact assessments would only really be sort of a minimum level of engagement. And so what we're sort of talking about here is what's on top of that. So if that's the minimum level, then what more should we be looking to do to sort of really, develop rigorous processes where, we're engaging appropriately with the stakeholders on this and looking to sort of develop partnerships as we're going forward to responsibly trial, potentially trial at least these organisms. And for the GBIRD partnership, which is the Genetic Biocontrol Invasive Rodents program, as we're working on mice, one of our particular the sites that we're looking at is islands, and islands that have the appropriate characteristics that would allow them to essentially be biosecure, for example.
Thank you, Karl. That's a good introduction to the complexity and interdisciplinarity involved in these kind of questions. Riley?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I'm glad we're starting with this question. I think it's really important and it's really interesting to hear everyone's expert insights on this. So for me, this actually prompts ethical questions about the places or the types of geographies that we more readily imagine and treat as field sites. So in my work, I think a lot about how islands in particular often get viewed as these sort of isolated, contained sites that are, therefore more amenable to different kinds of research and experimentation. And, historically, this has happened in many cases without the informed consent of local communities or indigenous peoples who call these islands home. In my work, I look at things like nuclear testing and military buildup on islands throughout Oceania. So for me, I'm really thinking about, that it's worth asking how the places we're sort of presently imagining as field sites for gene drive might fit into these sorts of histories, and really just remembering that the places that we are imagining, one person's field site may be another person's home, or in some cases ancestral land. So I'm really, heartened and encouraged to hear these great conversations emerging around community engagement and issues of consent and things like Indigenous self-determination. So I'm encouraged that we are headed in that direction, because I think it's really important when you're looking at the histories of places that tend to be sort of, thought of as field sites for different reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Riley. Naima?
Sure, thank you everyone, and good afternoon. And I guess the joy of sort of going in the middle/end part of the round robin means that a lot of the points that are very relevant to us at Target Malaria have already been made, particularly in terms of the safety and the efficacy and the studies that need to take place before field sites are even considered. So thank you for pointing that out, Karl. I think for us as Target Malaria, and just as an introduction for anyone who doesn't know, we're a nonprofit research consortium that aims to develop and share new cost-effective and sustainable genetic technologies to modify mosquitoes and reduce malaria transmission. And I think for us, when we're talking about site selection, it's important to sort of start at a higher level in terms of even how did we select the continent? How did we select the countries? Let alone how did we select the sort of the specific field sites? And so for Target Malaria, in terms of the site selection, in terms of continent selection, we went where the greatest need is. And after the African region, according to the WHO 2020 World Malaria Reports, continues to shoulder the heaviest burden of the disease. And so for us, it's at that level, that is why the region was selected as a site. And when we even start to think about further, what are the sites for? I think that's really important to consider. In addition to the points made about imagining the site and also the perspectives of the communities, it's important to differentiate early on according to the types of activities that the researchers are looking to conduct. In terms of field entomology, there are differences between a release site, let's say, or a monitoring site. And these differences are reflected in the engagement approaches and the engagement procedures that the stakeholder engagement team would be looking to conduct in these areas. And if we're looking, for example, at the potential release of gene-drive mosquitoes, there will be differences in the selection, whether we're talking about studies for entomological endpoints or studies for epidemiological endpoints. And even in these differences, there are considerations to be made. In the latter, one can anticipate then that the health infrastructure existing in a community, for example, will become more of a site selection criteria that needs to be taken into consideration. And so I think this is an opportunity for us to further dive into, I think, points that we as a panel coming from so many different perspectives can really learn from each other. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And Paulo.
Well, as a matter of fact, the experience we had in Brazil some years ago was with a transgenic mosquito, but it was not a gene drive. It was another genetic system, a male-specific gene that could somehow control the disease by killing the progeny. So the decisions for choosing, or the decision behind choosing, or better saying, the reasons why we choose an area were really based on the social aspects much more than the biological aspects, because it was a mosquito that inevitably would die if it escaped the region. So it was not a gene drive. But the social aspects were very important. And one of the major points was to choose a population which was, by this time, heavily impacted by the disease, which was dengue. So for them, the experiment would be a valuable acquisition. And moreover, they should be a bunch of people really independent in their thinking, not following trends or not following social media and things like that. So the choice was over a population really of very, let's say, not very poor, but poor citizens in a kind of isolated area. And this proved to be very useful because there was a lot of activism by this time against transgenic in Brazil, against GMOs. And the independent thinking of those people was a very important stronghold that sustained our activities for a long time. So if they were following trends, they would just move away from the project in the very beginning of it. But they stand in the line with us for a long time, and it was very good. So the independent behavior of the population of the target site for us is a very important point. And later on, we discovered that, for example, in Florida, there was just a lot of noise coming into the chosen area for the same mosquito release. And it was very difficult also in the Bahamas and other islands. So by the end of the day, the independency of these populations seemed to me, at least, a real key point, a very important point to be kept in mind.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Together, each of you, or all of you, have pointed out these complexities, these nuances, these tensions, especially as we think about the goal of this panel and integrating social criteria. Well, that's not a single homogeneous set of criteria. So what we're going to do is think through the layers of that complexity, but also the potential tensions and how those social criteria are set in conversation with some of these biological or ecological questions. And so one of the goals of this panel, and this one of the motivations for convening the group we have here today, is to think through these tensions, think through these histories, and think through the challenges of trying to do a transdisciplinary project, or even an interdisciplinary project, with all of these different things pulling on you. And I think that tension applies both to the public health question and to the conservation question. And so several of you have touched on this in your response. To give you an opportunity to hit this point home, I'm going to ask one more round robin question, and then we'll kind of open it up to a freer flowing conversation. So the last round robin question, and I'll go in a different order because Naima reminded us that the order matters. Like, you might think of something else, but somebody else said, and that's a really important reminder. So thank you. But the question is, what selection criteria do you prioritize? So if we're talking about field site selection, which do you prioritize and why? And Naima, I'm going to set you up first. Thank you.
Careful what you wish for. Thank you. So I think just to touch upon Paulo's point, And I guess to continue my flow of the disease burden being a critical selection criteria for the field site selection. And I think just to add to the complexity about the point about the disease burden is that I can stand here and quote the WHO report and say that we as Africans carried 93 or 94% of the infection rates and of the mortality rate per year of the malaria burden. But to add to sort of another level is that there is the need for the community itself within the site selection to perceive malaria as a burden and to see it and consider it to be as a burden for them in order for us to be able to work with them. And they also then need to be looking for, if they agree that the burden is there and that they recognize it, that is the point in which we can start to have a conversation about looking at new approaches to eliminating it. And I think that's something that's very important for us as the stakeholder engagement specialists and the social scientists to consider that there are multiple views here that need to be taken into account. And that sort of leads on to my second point, and I'm not going to list all of my criteria because there are many others here, but the point of culture. And it's important, for example, if we're talking about malaria and I'm talking about mosquitoes in my scenario, or our scenarios target malaria, I have to take into account the role of the mosquito in a culture or the absence of a role for mosquitoes. It's very important for us to go in there with an open mind and to consider, as Riley said, what is the reality of the community that operates there, not just an outsider's imagined reality. And it's important that even in the case of a suppression drive, the community on the site must be willing and understanding of the what it means to reduce a population of malaria transmitting mosquitoes. That can have a cultural impact that we maybe as the scientists haven't taken into account. And so I'm just here to add more complexity to a very already a very complex topic. So I will leave it at my 2 criteria for now that also need to be taken, and then we'll see if there's time later.
Thank you. And I like the ideas that you're bringing up around imaginary, you and Riley both. The imagine really sets us up for what's possible. So that idea, or just that term, is a really important one for what we're talking about here today. Thank you. Paulo, we're going out of order, so you're up next, please.
Well, the point here, I think, if I were to select, if we were here in Brazil to select something for, let's say, a gene drive rat in an island, we always would prefer to choose a small, low-income population with very limited mobility. And why again the low income? Because they are much more self-confident than the more wealthy people. Wealthy people are very much dependent on the others' opinions, and the poor people live by themselves. So that's why poor people are more self-confident, usually, not always, at least in Brazil, not everywhere in the world. And the third point will be somehow fine-tune, as Naima said, the community's priorities to the project's priorities. For example, in an island in Brazil, it would be easy to find a nice island to do the project, but I don't know if they really think rats are really a problem, although they are. But I don't know if the community will be fine-tuned with this idea. So it's very important to find the community's priorities and somehow agree with them and somehow see if you can cope with their priorities, because otherwise the project will be a failure, certainly. So this will be the basic criteria: low-income populations and fine-tuning the population's priorities to the project's priorities.
Before we move on to the next one, I wanna do a quick follow-up here. So you talk about low-income communities and their self-confidence and relative independence about how they think about issues as compared with affluent communities. I've never heard that. That's really fascinating. How do you balance this idea of self-confidence with potential power differences? So I often imagine that we're thinking of a lot of low-income communities having less power. And so this project may be thrust on them. And it sounds like you're saying something a little different. Can you speak to that tension?
Well, I would suggest, if I'm not leading any project anymore, but I would suggest if you want to see how a community could change their mind, you should do a power map for the community. A power map is simply a kind of XY map where you put interests from one side and the power to do something on the other side. So there are many stakeholders which have very much interest in the project, but which are not powerful. They can do nothing. And others which do not have that much interest, but they have a lot of power. So these stakeholders have to be captured by the project leadership and act on favor of the project. So these power maps are really fundamental to take decisions. And I seldom see them in projects. So this is something that, in my opinion, is fundamental. That's where we discovered, by using power maps, we discovered what was the most self-confident and reliable community that could not be changed in its opinion by the surrounding noise. And so the power maps may be a solution, but I am not leading any project, so I can't discuss that in detail anymore.
Thank you. And I like that we're bringing up actual methodology. It's not just these abstract ideas of what does it mean to engage conversations in communities. Yeah, this power map idea is really compelling. Riley, I'm interested in what you would respond to some of what we just heard. Of course, your perspective in general, but in particular, perhaps your perspective may set up a different one than what we just heard.
Sure. So this, yeah, I'm thinking about a lot right now. First, I think when I'm thinking of criteria, I would really like to see us push beyond like this safety efficacy framework that I think is pretty normative, like to the regulatory process, or at least expand how we're thinking of safety and efficacy to account for more, I think as Naima framed really nicely, like these like place-based definitions of, for example, like what matters to a community. I think you can kind of take that sort of approach to things like safety. Safety to me, or this gets more into risk assessment too, but some concepts like risk and benefit, I would think are really contingent upon whoever's defining them. So I think setting up activities where you can have some more collaborative definition with community stakeholders and other stakeholders to kind of nail down and be really intentional about what we mean by safety would feel really important. And also I say pushing up beyond safety and efficacy to think, I think a little bit more kind of upfront about these issues of power that we're starting to talk about. And maybe that criteria could also account for things like justice and equity a little more intentionally. And I've also been thinking about this power map idea, which is really interesting. And when I picture it, I sort of think of like, what if you have a global map of sort of the landscape of gene drive development and then also deployment, or where we're imagining putting a gene drive for a trial versus an endpoint, like what would it look like, right? Where I would love to see a map of all of the funding sources, where the capital is sort of coming from and then concentrated for the development of a technology. And then what it looks like if you draw a line to where we're imagining putting those technologies, and just as a way to open up conversation, you know, across stakeholders and as a sort of artifact for communities and for regulators to engage with, to say, what are maybe some of the power imbalances that could be playing out in the ways that we're starting to think about developing and deploying these technologies. And I think that could be an interesting way to start to grapple with some of these questions about the sort of power structures that were implicated in different ways. And the last thing I'll say about that is that I think in terms of criteria for particular communities, and somebody in the chat raised a question about informed consent that I'd love to get to later in more detail. But I think that we can start to prioritize things like relationship building more than just consent or authorization, which I think are really important, but also really thorny concepts that deserve more unpacking. But there was some great conversation in the last stakeholder engagement panel about, you know, the importance of building relationships across stakeholders and trust in that way that I think can get us beyond sort of the limited focus on authorization or consent.
Thank you. And a couple of quick responses. One, I really appreciate the idea of looking at power maps at multiple scales. So we're not just talking about interpersonally, which is also really important, especially as we think through engagement, like the practicalities of being at the table, but also globally. We're looking at these distributions of project, fund, site, like all of these connections and the links between those two scales are very important. And as a quick note about audience questions, I'm going to cycle back around to them, but just to the viewers participating at home, you can start adding questions in the chat and we'll pull them as we're able. But again, we're going to go through a few questions and then we'll start pulling questions. So if you're interested in adding to the conversation, please feel free to just throw your question directly into the chat. From there, there's two more panelists to answer this general question though, and I would like to hear from Karl's perspective because he's worked on these certainly in practice. I would like to hear your thoughts on these criteria prioritizations.
Thanks, Katie. Super interesting discussion. One of the things, you know, when we think about criteria, I think it's useful to sort of think about, you know, what are the required, you know, and what are the desirable criteria. And so, you know, some are nice to have, or and often very nice to have, and others are absolute requirements. And those ones you sort of, you know, want to be holding to those. And then, you know, with these, you're trying to add on as many of the desirable pieces as you possibly can. And you only have a limited number of potential sites, you know, that you're looking at on this. And so these are actually quite challenging to apply in reality. It's relatively easier to make up a list and work through that. It's much harder to actually then start applying that and then thinking through the nuances within each of those. And this, again, it depends on the modified organism. And so the context here is dependent on which of those, you know, for certain things, you know, for different modified organisms, some of those desired and desirable and required criteria may actually, you know, mix around. Some that may be required for others may even move to be desirable. And so that may not be absolute requirements. And I think here, you know, it's very important to not pick out any one of them, because often if you focus too much on one, you're ignoring a whole suite of others. And so with this, it's the part of this is, for me, it's really sort of the entire package. It's the package and it's how that's basically put into the context that you're talking about, and the application of that. And that's when you sort of really get into, you know, this has to be sort of case by case, if you will. But there are some generalities, you know, that can be pulled out of this. And Kanya Long and Omar Akbari and a suite of other authors, you know, including myself, had a go at this not too long ago. So in December 2020, there was a science paper that came out. And it's pretty relevant for this. It's called Core Commitments of Field Trials for Gene Drive Organisms. So it's sort of relevant, you know, for what we're talking about today. And within this paper, they structured it in under sort of 4 different categories, which I think is just an interesting, you know, and useful framing for this. And those sort of 4 categories, I'll just go through them. One is a fair partnership and transparency. And so this is working with communities, this is working with regulators and other stakeholders, the product efficacy and safety. So what does that look like? The regulatory evaluation and the risk benefit assessment, and then the monitoring and mitigation that goes on with it. And that includes exit strategies. So that includes, okay, what have you got in your back pocket, basically, if something doesn't play out as suspected potentially, and it provides some potential options there. Plus, you want to be learning. So these are the whole reason around these. These are learning opportunities potentially for the next one, or to help apply to other parts. And so the monitoring piece of this is also very important on how that's applied.
Thank you, Karl, and thanks for reminding us about that piece. There's a lot of authors involved in that piece, and it's a really relevant piece for today's conversation. Tim, what selection criteria have you been thinking about prioritizing, and why?
Yeah, I think without touching the social aspect, which I'm least expert in, I think at the end of the day, I think we need to have a data demonstrable, which is clearly visible by the community that what we do has an impact is important. So from that point of view, it's very important that the target organism we are targeting is a dominant organism. If we had a competing or similar, another species similar, which could take over what you have done and nullify what you have already done. I think it's worrying in Africa. We have two dominant species, are Gambier and Arabiensis, whereby lots of our working on Gambier, what we have to look into what would happen, Arabiensis taking over the situation and everything goes wrong. And again, another problem I see is the generalist versus specialist impact. You have bed net, which is protecting from all biting insects, which is visible by the community. And actually, the reason people keeping bed net is it's visibly protecting them from other biting insects, especially Quilex, especially non-vector species. So the species we are dealing with, gene drive, are invisible probably for them. And the community appreciates that easily. So that's a big question. I think the area should have a mono-vector system would be an ideal area where you have whatever you knock down is visible easily, and the population will go along with you with that. The other thing, without touching, I think the isolation thing, which is the island, is that people dealing with mosquitoes, you need to have kilometers of hundreds of kilometers away so that you could have clear, visible isolation containment. It's not going to be containment in areas like Lake Victoria, where you have about tens of kilometers. It only could minimize reinvasion, dilution of your effect. Maybe people looking into isolation thing, I think they should look. There are no barrier in Africa for mosquitoes for gene flow at that moment. As far as another thing is, if you are working in Africa and the mosquitoes, more remote areas are stability of the community. However much social work you did, and one war or one something will ruin everything. So the history of the area, stability is very important, especially working in Africa. Another thing is, if you are nearby a bordering country where you have flying insects around, you are potentially causing war between the countries. Probably you'll make sure that it's not bordering to a country and probably quite far away, not to ignite volatile environment around the community. So I see wider stuff, and these are the main things I would be interested to see if we got islands like this, the ideal islands like this. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Hate to tell you, but you kept saying I don't want to talk about the social, and then half of what you talked about was social. I think that's a really important indication of how the social and the ecological they're in the same system. And some of the points you raised were really compelling, because while there are certain things that these cases and issues share, there's critical need to make sure we understand that there are certain trends and things to consider, but then each community has a very specific set of needs and histories, and that's neighbors. So that's a really important set of issues to consider, both in African countries where you may work, and then some of these other places that some of the island conservation folks are working, but these are critically important. So I heard this sort of tension between the need to prioritize social on one hand, but also the critical need to understand how the entomological or the ecological systems are also working. I will come back to that in a few minutes. But something that's come up in the chat and something that I'm really interested in. So I'll read the question that I have, and then we can talk through how to get it and answer together. So I'll start with the chat comment and see if we can work our way into that too. So the chat comment was, informed consent was developed with the individual in mind. Because consensus is almost impossible to achieve when it comes to communities, this person thinks it's pragmatically challenging to seek informed consent for communities. And the question is, do we have frameworks to get community approval that do not involve informed consent framework? Could we borrow engagement models developed by political scientists, like deliberative democracy frameworks? And so that's from the chat. And I sort of add another little piece to that from my own set of questions. Well, who is identifying and representing the social here? So we talk about the need for interdisciplinarity. We talk about the need for mixing social and natural sciences. But how are we getting this social dimension represented? So either through social scientists or community members. So again, thinking about, that's a sort of double-barreled question, but I think we can unpack it a little bit, is thinking about what models do we have for consent? And then also, who's coming to think about these models? What social folks are we including in this conversation? And this again is sort of just try the free flow conversation. So if you're ready, jump in anytime.
Well, maybe I'll just jump in quickly just to, first of all, I haven't seen the chats, but to thank whoever asked that question, because that's something that is already very popularly understood. And even the WHO has communicated that while the recognition of the importance of the guidance to be created is agreed, there's still insufficient clear guidelines about the inadequacy of individual consent for area-wide vector control, particularly when it comes to using modified mosquitoes. And the truth is that where we are in terms of international guidelines and best practice, the existing documentation does not provide specific guidance about what is acceptable and legitimate for community consent. And as a result, we're in a position now where you're so right, it's discussing what is the appropriate terminology when talking about community agreement, when talking about permission being provided for research activities, and how we as a community of gene drive and researchers come together to create a common understanding of some of these issues. And I think it's really important that when we talk about how we identify the relevant stakeholders and the community within which to engage with, there needs to be a distinction also between the affected communities that will be impacted directly by the activities, the research activities, even if we're putting sort of gene drive deployment aside right now, but even just talking about the research activities that we're working on, there needs to be an understanding about how we distinguish between relevant communities, those who with tangible and immediate interest and impact on the work we're doing, versus the general public or others who have interest, have perspectives, but may not necessarily be directly impacted. So I think that's something that we all do need to discuss. How is a community defined even in these discussions?
I think that's a really interesting bit of how do you even define who you should be working with, essentially on these, and it's definitely one of the challenges. Frequently these are, I think we often we sort of fall back on a concept. Well, one of the concepts to consider within this is sufficient consensus. So how do you get to make a decision? And that can be anything. What is sufficient consensus can be anything from the formal power decision maker, a single person potentially saying yes or no to this, all the way sort of through a spectrum essentially that gets you to, well, it's 100% or not. So it's either everybody's on board. And then there's a sort of a whole suite of things in between as well within that sufficient consensus. And societally, we use a lot of different systems to try and get to these things. It's a vote. Yeah. Oh, if you get more than whatever the other option is, then potentially it goes forward. But maybe not. Maybe you're looking for something more on the vote. Maybe there's other thresholds that are kind of put in place. And I think this is some of the challenges as well. Once you actually identify who are you working with, is then how do decisions get made? Particularly if you don't have tools, if you will, at your disposal that clearly lay those out. Societal tools, if you will, that help to lay out how those decisions should be made. Now you're also trying to develop decision-making, processes around this within these. And so, go on.
Sorry, Karl, I just wanted to thank you so much for bringing that up, the point about the importance of discussing, yes, within a gene drive research community, discussing these models, but recognizing that these models then need to be co-developed with the communities. Their decision-making processes must be taken into consideration and must be fed back into whatever model is decided for their decision-making. And I think that's where there has to be a certain level of humility in our approach to engaging communities about their definitions of community, but particularly their procedures for making decisions. And that has to be something that is developed together. And it's something that of course, we as a community are responsible for making sure that ethical considerations are at the forefront, and international best practice and guidance, which does exist in terms of how to ethically engage, but then how that is taken a step further to making sure that there is ownership and authentic, true, genuine co-development in terms of then taking the steps together towards agreeing on a model. It can't be a model that a research institution imposes. It has to be something that is co-developed. And this is where another conversation about how early a research organization enters the community. You must enter at a point where you can still have dialogue and things are still open-ended, as opposed to when it's moment of decision-making.
I like where this is going, Naima, and I'll just pull back into one of the things that Tib mentioned earlier, and what he was sort of getting at, I think, was really around motivation. And so the communities that you end up working with need to have a motivation, for why they would want to engage in this, and it needs to sort of be sufficient, for them to want to undertake, some of the risks. Whether they be perceived or whether they be real risks. And from the outside, you need to treat both perceived and real risks, or what we would call, scientific risks, if you will. And we would actually, you'd have to treat those equally. And often you have to be mitigating or working out how you can get past those risks on that. And you have to treat them, both as if they're sort of real risks. And Tib was, talking there about, if you're only removing one of the biting insects, then there's not a lot of motivation potentially for the community to engage on it. But if there's a significant, mortality factor, so people in your community are dying and family members are dying, that's a pretty good motivation, for why you might want to, undertake some of this work. Similarly, if your livelihood is being impacted heavily and you can't feed your family, that's a pretty good motivation, as well. And so some of these things, again, these are personal pieces, and at the moment I'm sort of treading a very fine line of actually talking about other people's values without, having identified them and have them, self-identify what their values are with this. Part of sort of, I think, where I'm going with this is these are really obviously challenging issues when you start dealing with communities. And this is why, at least in the GBIRD partnership, we're looking to uninhabited islands, to work on as our trial sites. And you'd think, oh, uninhabited island. Well, okay, you're not dealing with people then. Well, you still have to deal with people, but the complexity is less. And so there's still people that, utilize those islands. There's still land managers and the like that are involved in those islands. And so you're still dealing with people, you're just having to deal with fewer. And so the complexity is reduced.
Thank you. This next question I'm drawing from the audience from Sam Evans, brings up a lot of the things you were just talking about, and I think also draws on Riley's work in terms of talking about just the field trial itself and some of the other points of conversation. So Sam points out that a lot of this conversation and the core commitments paper that Karl referenced is focusing on the field trials, which is, what the title of the panel is. But there's this relationship and sort of unspoken, but needs to be spoken issue of how are we relating field trial to ultimate deployment? So are we thinking about that, like if the field trials are conducted in one place and then full release happens in another, do you start at the beginning? Are we assuming that field trials and deployment are somehow connected? Or are we assuming that there's transferability of lessons learned from, how we're not just conducting field trials around the technology, we're talking about the social systems too. So what is, in your experience and your perspective, what is the relationship between this sort of first attempt field trial and then ultimately deployment, either hypothetically or in your actual work experience?
If I can comment, say something on that. In our approach, as I said, we are very cautious of the problem of driving, gene drive. So what we did is we had anti-malarial effector non-driving components separately developed for testing in the lab and in the field site in Tanzania, and which is in a high security containment being built now, CL3 system, using the field strain of mosquito or field strain of the parasite. It's in the field, but it's highly contained in the field. And then once we are happy, the last bit will be released for final test in an island, knowing we are confident, quite confident that it will impact. And then it's gonna be going through more testing in the field in actual atmosphere, open atmosphere, and then gonna be used for asset deployment. So there are layers of testing, but we are bit by bit taking it into the field. And once we are very happy with the effector is working, then the driving component comes. Once everybody happy and agreed that effector was driving, then it's gonna be driven in the open later. So we are down the line, long way of layers of process are being taught.
So thank you. And to clarify, this stepwise process you're describing, does that all take place on the same island? So you're building each of the steps in this once you leave the lab, are they all in the same geographic space?
So first test will be here at Imperial, and then we take to Bagamoyo, which is in IHI laboratories, which we have high security lab being built now. And we're going to test that using field strain of mosquito, field strain of the parasite. And once we are happy they are doing what they are doing in the field strains, then we move to the island. That is the final bit of third stage of testing. And then, and still then it's not driving strain yet. So once we are happy that the effector is doing what we supposed is supposed to do. Then the driving comes in the last bit, fourth stage kind of thing. We are thinking that way. So I think we are against rushing the driving thing into the play quite quickly. And that is a regulatory and monitoring process when we do phase-wise, step-by-step, component-by-component kind of testing. I don't know whether I answered that question.
Each case is different. Yes, thank you. I think the question is, now that there's more coming through the chat and just building on some of these other questions, I think the question is, we're focusing so much on the field site selection, of course, we talked about that being the title. Are any of these field sites potentially not deployment sites, I guess is a simpler way to put it. And that's for anyone, that's not just not trying to single out TIB. So that may be a question for Karl or Naima or even Paulo, past experience, or any of the field site selection potential not necessarily being used, or not necessarily potential sites for ultimate deployment.
Yeah, well, I could tell a story about these transgenic mosquitoes in Brazil. The site selection, the field site selection was difficult, but they finally found two places which were in this area where I live now, in the northeastern part of Brazil, for climate and isolation reasons, and also for social reasons. By the end of the day, however, the mosquito was approved for commercial release. And once that happens, there is no more criteria except the commercial criteria. So once you have the product approved, and in this case it was a transgenic mosquito, the company could sell the mosquito to whatever place able to buy it. And what we saw is that the same problems that were seen in the field release areas also appears later on in the commercial release, during the commercial release. So some kind of protest, some kind of doubts, some movements against the product, or on the contrary, some movements in favor of the use of the products. So the same balance that we have seen in the field release areas was reproduced again in the commercial release, during the commercial release. And it's still being reproduced after more than almost 10 years. So it's about, I think that human beings are rather similar everywhere, but we have to be very confident on the product to release it in a commercial scale. And so for gene drives, well, I am not so confident. It's still not so confident, maybe in the near future.
And maybe if I could just add, I think, Paulo, thank you so much, because that was, like you said, it was the commercial perspective of the potential for gene drive. And I think it's really interesting to think about the instances in which research groups are working on tools that would be not commercialized and that would have global access commitments affiliated with it, like the ones that target malaria. And I think it's important to recognize that the technology in some instances like ours is expected to be relatively easy and inexpensive to implement when that time comes. And while target malaria, we are the researchers, and it's still up for discussion what it would actually look like if and when the deployment moment arrives. The decisions on deployment, so whether it's site selection, as the question was asked in the chat, would be made by the governments and their national malaria control programs, because they are the ones who would be in charge of the deployment and the decisions made accordingly. So I think it's important to remember that In some instances, the technology will be made available and accessible, particularly when we're talking about the topics of power dynamics. When we talk about site selection, again, in target malaria, it's based on our understanding of the fact that it's typically the malaria is a rural disease that affects the majority of the rural communities, which more often than not are the least empowered. So part of our positioning about focusing on the most disenfranchised, or the voices that aren't always heard, is making the commitments that then those communities need to be positioned at the center of our discussion when it comes to site selection, but as a result also to then the access to the technology if and when it is approved and safe and tested. So I think it's just important to maintain the nuances that exist in the technology that we all talk about. There are different approaches. Some can be commercial, others are not.
Katie, I think trying to I think what you were asking and putting that into sort of the G-bird case where we're working with mice on islands to prevent extinctions is, does your first trial have to prevent an extinction, for example? And so are you trying to get to those kind of end goals, with your trials as well? And I think you want to separate them. I think your initial goals with this is you may not get to some of those final goals if you can't increase confidence early on in this. And I think that's sort of a big part of what you're trying to do. And so some of the things that we've wrestled with and definitely haven't come up with with directions yet on where that is, but some of the things that we've been considering is, because of the challenges that I spoke about a little bit before, of actually trying to get all of the required criteria met and as many of the desirable ones as you can, you end up with only a handful of places that might have mice on them, for example. So there's a handful of islands, maybe even globally, that meet all of those criteria of where you would actually consider. And so to increase basically the number there, or to make these, one of the things that we've considered is actually introducing mice onto an island. So establishing a population specifically for the goal of conducting trials. And so there, you may be able to get more of all of your required criteria and more desirable criteria. And then obviously, you've got to be thinking outside of that. Okay, well, what's the social and political systems that you're now working within, and what's their motivations, for wanting to do this? And so there needs to be some downstream, if you will, benefits for them of why they would want to, to go to all this effort and do that. But I think here, what the thing you're trying to do is you're trying to deal with concerns, from people and how they're voiced in different ways. And you're looking to create, in that case, you're looking to try and create the scenario that sort of best fits, if you will, into that for increasing confidence.
That's really interesting. And this thread and part of the chat thread have reminded me a bit of this question of this zone of sacrifice. So we have places that are going to be the labs, like, there's still their environmental releases, but there's still the labs, and there's some power potential to consider here. And that clearly reminds me of a lot of Riley's work, especially thinking through some of the histories here. So as we think about this relationship between what our goals are, either for field site selection or more broadly, and how those two relate, how do we account for histories like power dynamics, the colonial landscape, in a way that supports forward-looking and just decisions? Big question.
I love this question, so I'll take a stab, though I do think it's complicated. But yeah, I like the framing of this question. How can we think of the histories in ways that are forward-looking? Because I think that you can't really think about a future built on more just and equitable decisions without looking at the history and without looking at the kinds of power imbalances that are playing out today that are informed by history. So for me, this means, you know, in my own work, as I shared, like looking at the histories of colonialism and ongoing dynamics of settler colonialism in Oceania, and including how that shapes these different imaginaries of islands and how they get used. I think this connects nicely to the previous question because, and I'm glad that you brought that up, Katie, you know, are there instances in which the trial site is different than the deployment site? Because that does raise a certain point of discomfort for me, right? Like, is an island becoming sort of a simulation for some other space or a continental space? Is it, are we presuming it's safer to test it on these contained islands? And if so, safer for whom? So I think in my own way I look at this, I am looking at history and I'm looking at the way certain colonial dynamics are still playing out to ask these kinds of questions. And I think that it's important we kind of build these reflexive skills to continue doing that. You know, in my experience, sometimes speaking in different sort of gene drive deliberative spaces with folks who have all different kinds of stakes in sort of the research and development side of this, I think it can feel sort of like, oh, it's so negative and it's so heavy to like think about these histories. But for me, I think of it, you know, because I actually have a lot of hope that we can make better decisions than we have. And I believe that we won't ever do that unless we are thinking about these sort of at times uncomfortable histories. So I'll leave it at that for now.
And to build on that a little bit, I also love that question. It's mine. But I also think it's important to remember we're also talking about a question of representation. So for some people, not wanting to think and talk about these troubled histories is a real problematic way of saying that's not mine, I don't have to worry about it. When we need more people, like that's the point. We need people involved for whom that is their history, because that's the only way we deeply understand these perspectives. So that's why, to me, these are critically important questions that dovetail absolutely essentially with who's involved in these conversations.
I could add on this from my mosquito point of view and my experience in Africa, I think the colonial history is playing live and active in every corner, every direction, both in West and in Africa as well. And I think it's very important that we realize that people who have been affected by one or another because of their race or their sex, they could be a little bit apprehensive about new technology coming from other end or one end or another. So that's, for example, the COVID-19 vaccines at the moment. If I'm in London now, then clearly people from Asia and minority groups are reluctant about the vaccine. And if we say that history is not playing a role, we are very naive. And I think my assumption is, as developers, we working in the West should be a bit humble. We take that very seriously, and I think we can refrain from attitude of we can do what we want kind of attitude should be stopped. I think if you say it's not me, that's very good, but most of us have that, because very recently I was discussing with a high-profile individual in the field and saying that, oh, don't worry about containment, it's not going to be worse than what is in Africa anyway. So if we are scientists of that, I think that person, probably individual, is very honest. But most of us, we do not say that, we do it. And so this is very fresh and alive, and they are push attitude from the other corner and, other attitudes. So I think we should be humble, learn, take steps, build trust with the community, and appreciate that problem is alive and it's there. Sometimes we can have power and buy some political wills, but it's not going to take us anywhere. I think we need to be calm down and take time and think thoroughly, change our attitude and appreciate the problem there. It's a problem. It is a problem. People even don't want to take pills. Lots of technologies are being pushed back because even the language we are using, population replacement, is a colonial language. and the population suppression is a colonial language. So we are not caring of what we are doing. So it's very important as a person who knows things from grassroots. Thanks.
I think we often look at these, and when we talk about previously disadvantaged communities, or where colonial era and these kind of things have occurred, I think we tend to sort of think of a negative reframing, if you will, or a negative framing, and think automatically of things being imposed upon those communities. But I think there's opportunity here actually for like a positive reframing of this. And I think, working through actually processes where you engage in dialogue, and you seek to basically, understand values. You identify concerns in conjunction with them, because the people, that are potentially looking to manage aspects of these projects or trials also have concerns. And so it's a sort of a co-design / co-concerns piece here. And I think the piece that we're often not thinking of is the vision. The vision of the communities or the stakeholder groups that are there. And I think there's even opportunities here for this to, these trials to play into some of those power dynamics, to actually readjust them, to seek new balances with this. And projects that I've been involved with, for example, here in the Galapagos Islands with Floriana Islands, one of the first things that we identified was a significant power imbalance. And that community was typically ignored. It still doesn't, you see the census. There's 3 inhabited islands apparently in the Galapagos. No, there's actually 4. One of them smaller than the others. It still doesn't, in the last 15 years, hasn't showed up on censuses. Yeah, and things like this. And so you can't even identify fully, who's in the community and these kind of things. However, the project and the projects that we undergo at the moment, utilizing traditional technologies, are not without, a suite of concerns and other things. And we've just been through a process that, more than a decade, and it's looking like in a couple of years that, we'll be implementing that project for removing invasive rodents off that island, utilizing traditional technologies, which involves the use of second generation anticoagulant toxicants. And so this brings a whole suite of sort of concerns and things to it. But one of the things that we've, the community's taken that project with is to actually rebalance, some of that aspect of power and decision making, and positioning themselves, within the series of, communities that make up the Galapagos. So I think there's opportunities as well here, not just sort of in a full negative framing for communities that may have previously, been negatively impacted. I think there's possibilities in working with them on actually positive reframing, and how do you sort of have this play into, their future vision? Where do they want to go with this?
And I just wanted to add briefly, if I may, Katie, that I think this is obviously, especially in the current climate globally, these are important conversations that need to continue to be had across all forums. And I think it's also important to recognize that the concerns raised are completely accurate and need to be highlighted. But as such, it's also an opportunity, as Karl said, to see where can the development community, the developers community come together to recognize the instances where there are kernels of instances where the narrative is being shifted, the paradigm is being shifted. Just the fact that right now in these discussions, the region of West Africa is actually very advanced in discussions around gene drive regulations and policy creation. And the fact that there's commitments from organizations like the African Union Development Agency and NEPAD, AUDA NEPAD, to prepare joint guidelines on how to evaluate any requests from developers on gene drive organisms, and to create regional African-owned platforms to manage vector controls. So these guidelines will inform an entire region of African-owned, African-led scientists and policymakers. And so I think it's about recognizing what are researchers and developers doing to support that, but it's also recognizing that you get scientists of African origin who are playing a role in gene drive, and that principal investigators are doing incredible work. African scientists are doing incredible work to push this forward. So I think there's also something to be said about the fact that sometimes in our language we can sort of separate the beneficiaries from the scientists, but in many cases, the beneficiaries are the scientists and they are doing the work. And it's also then another sort of can of worms, but also another point when we talk about power dynamics, the scientists versus the non-scientists, and creating an equality and equity and justice around those, the dialogue that exists between the sort of scientific experts, but then the other holders of knowledge in the communities. So I think it's just important that we carry on these discussions, but recognize that we too have a commitment to shifting the narrative and really highlighting the instances where scientists and policymakers on the continent and in other regions, I'm sure, are working very hard to be the voice.
Thank you. And I think there's a really interesting arc that's just come out of the last few minutes. As one, of course, we want to grapple with these troubled histories. Otherwise, we're just replicating some of these existing power dynamics. But as we think through the lens of colonialism and even post-colonial studies, there are certainly mapped on implications globally from colonial histories, and we can't argue with that. But then we also need to remember that within that complex history, these communities and even entire regions that we think of as sort of like the colonized had agency as well, and there's a lot of work coming. And it's, I think in our imagination, often, if we're not careful, we assume, I think like Naima was pointing out, that the agency and the science and some of these other really powerful dimensions of projects aren't coming from these places, and they are. So it's not always a question of like the work's being done here and then the potential testing, there, and then some of the power dynamics really set up in challenging questions. But there's also the need to attend to the fact that, and Karl's comment spoke to this as well, is that some of this is empowering, some of this really puts agency back in the hands of some people who have either not traditionally had a lot of power to decide for themselves, or also that there's a lot of science actually coming out of the places that are looking to do these field trials. And I think we need to make sure we're careful with how we use language around colonial history, because it without unpacking some of these terms, leaves a lot of assumptions uncontested. I don't know, I think I'm gonna try to go for this question. It's a little bit challenging, but as we talk through some of the issues around community engagement, representation, and all of these questions, I've heard some interesting talks, especially from the folks who've done the work in target malaria, of this tension between making sure we're attending to traditional governance structures, and then how do we know who's legitimately representing a community? How do you infuse some of that with maybe a greater gender equity? Like, there's some real interesting questions around how to get representation from communities and what that means, and how that might be in some tension with existing or traditional, whatever, governance structures.
I mean, you just presented one of the challenges, I think, there, Katie. Some of these are matriarchal, decision-making systems, for example. And so you've got, these traditional systems. So if you're looking for gender equity, then, you need to work to balance that. But then how much are you imposing, outsider views, if you will, upon them? And so potentially very interesting questions. No one's keen to touch that.
I think if I can say something, it varies because it varies from country to country, the community structure. I worked in Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, all varies, all different. But there are communal kind of very basic structure. One is the appointed community spokesman of the government, the local structure, which everybody falls into because there is more power there. Although it's politically manipulated, maybe there's more power there. Whether that representation is the right one, I don't know, but it's less trusted by the majority. But it gets things done. The other one, which everybody is scared of or escapes, is the faith-based leadership. I think in countries like in East Africa, I think very strong, the faith-based loyalty is very strong. And the power is very strong. And it little been done approaching into them. I don't know whether, but, and another one is the traditional elders, the community clan leaders are there. But for me, I think the combination of all would work better. If we fall into the easier one, which is a political spokesman, it's easy to buy them or push them, but it's not going to take us a long way. But the faith-based leadership is strong, and the community or clan leaders are there, very consistent, sustainable. So probably Naomi will say more, but the structure vary, but they are there. But with some choose and pick kind of thing will not represent properly.
No, I think, Tib, you captured the fact that it's case by case very well, and that there is no one size fits all. I think we as stakeholder engagement experts or social scientists, developers, we have a commitment to recognizing that there is best practice for any engagement. I think sometimes Gene Drive is such a novel tool that we tend to assume every aspect of our work is exceptionalized. But in some ways, there's some parts of stakeholder engagement procedures that are standard no matter what sector you're working in. Transparency, honesty, openness, authenticity, ethical foundations. These are, no matter what you're trying to do, whether you're trying to build a dam in a community or you're trying to build a building in a community, there's some fundamentals of stakeholder engagement that transcend Gene Drive. But I do think that in our context, because it's so complex, we have to come in, again, because this is a field site selection panel, when we are considering sites, you have to approach it with humility, with the recognition that we have, whether it's project-based, culture-based, geographic-based, pre-existing notion of what is right and what is just and what is ethical. And it's internally as a project, as a research institution, identifying what your principal foundations are, but then also having to go in with a certain amount of flexibility to accommodate the structures that exist in the communities, in the countries in which you operate. And that could be very different from your regular norms. So I think, just to close it off, Katie, I think the main word I will use is humility, to go in and understand that this is a two-way dialogue discussion, and as much as possible, not to go in with a fixed framework or fixed mentality for what is right and what is not.
I'd love to jump in quickly too. I think a lot of what Naima just shared resonates with me a lot. And if I may, I might tie it back also to this question of like what social scientists can represent, because that's something in my own experience, I grapple with a lot. And I feel pretty confident in saying, I think aligned with what most folks have said on this panel today, that any effort to represent community input needs to be done collaboratively and needs to have multiple opportunities to iteratively revisit and revise, whatever is getting represented as a kind of output of a given engagement. So I think those relationships are really important. And I feel pretty confident in saying that no social scientist should not on their own be able to represent the social issues or anything like that. In my own research, I recognize I am the instrument of my research. I am filtering everything that I'm taking in through my own standpoint and my own training, and whatever I interpret will reflect that. So, I care very deeply about communities that I work with throughout Oceania. I identify with them in various ways too. So I do my best to represent what they have told me in a very honest and reflexive way, but I'm also constantly trying to be aware of, what biases I might be bringing to my own work. And I think that's a skill that we all stand to practice as much as we can in this space. And I know we're getting short on time, but one more thought on that is that a challenge I have also of doing interviews, for example, with Kanaka Maoli or Native Hawaiians in my work is that I do have a certain discomfort of trying to represent what might be, a stance of particular communities on a technology, for instance, or things that might be, say a barrier to acceptance, because I do fear that that might get then taken up in these sort of strategic or persuasive activities, which is not what my hope would be as far as those things, as how those things are getting used. So that's something that I grapple with a lot in what I'm even, framing in my own work.
Thank you. And I have a similar fear, especially trying to do allied scholarship, being mindful of what my role could be. And half of a phrase or half of a sentence is taken up and used the wrong way when the rest of the sentence implies something very different, or paragraph or whatever. I am amazed. Suddenly it is 11:26. I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. I do want to give Paulo, put you on the spot, the opportunity, since you haven't had as much opportunity to speak in the last few rounds, to make sure that you get your perspective in, especially thinking about your experience with representation in communities. You have something to add.
Well, I think that we have to be really very humble. So humility is the fundamental approach in any field work with these communities. And we have been really challenged again and again and again when we do those works for whatever reason. And if we try to impose decisions or impose points of view, this is very bad. So I think that Target Malaria and all of you are really in the right direction. And based on my experience, not just on on genetic modified organisms, but really on working with communities. That's something that I do for in my last 30 years. So if you are not using this humble approach of coming not with a solution in your hands, but with open mind and getting inputs before taking whatever decision, this is good. This is what you should do. So I really apologize for my English, but I think that I understood most of what you told, and I agree with you.
We understand your point perfectly. And as we think through some of these questions, I think we've started a good set of conversations here. I don't think any of us would claim to have resolved anything today, but I want to thank all of our panelists. I think this was a really lovely example of bringing a compelling balance of expertise and epistemic humility. This was a really nice conversation, and everyone brought up novel ideas and worked together to present new things, and sort of worked out some of the tensions that we really have to think through as we consider these complex questions. And with that, I want to thank all of you out there for attending. I want to thank our panelists for their time and expertise, both in prep and in participating today. And with that, I think I'll pass the mic to Karen for her wrap up.
Thank you very much, Katie, for moderating today's panel. And thank you to panelists Karl, Naima, Paulo, Riley, and Tib for stimulating conversation and for challenging our participants. The next session in this series is scheduled for Tuesday, May 11th. It will focus on the question of what is the role of consensus in stakeholder engagement. And Dr. Cinnamon Bloss of the University of California, San Diego will be moderating what will likely be another rousing discussion. We look forward to seeing you again next month. So goodbye just for now.